We are good. There you go. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Yumna. Great.
Welcome in, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to have you all here.
Yeah. Why don't we go ahead and get started as people are coming in. Hello and welcome to the webinar, Taking Action, Creating Social Change Through Strength, Solidarity, Strategy, and Sustainability. Thank you all for being here. Special thanks to Dr. Ahluwalia and Dr. Toporek. My name is Elizabeth Roby, she, her, and I'm an editor at Coherent Digital and publisher of a new online database called Mindscape Commons.
Thanks, Elizabeth. My name is Yumna Rahim. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an academic outreach coordinator at Coherent Digital. We're an online academic publishing group, and we're just so excited and happy to host this webinar today for you all. And we're also just honored to have Dr. Ahluwalia and Dr. Toporek speak today about their work in social justice and creating social change through this model that they have developed. So as more of you continue to join the call, I'm just going to pull up a quick slide with some housekeeping details before we begin. One moment. So this webinar will be recorded. We're currently recording. We will email the link out with the recording in just a few days. So thank you for your patience in advance. Closed captioning is available. So if you'd like a live transcript or subtitles as we're speaking, please just direct yourself to the bottom of your Zoom window. There should be a little CC button that you can turn on for subtitles. So please feel free if you'd like. And we encourage you all to use the chat box. I think when you click on the chat box, there's an opportunity to type directly to the panelists or panelists plus attendees. So we recommend, if you'd like to, please open your chat to attendees so that we can all kind of share the chat and see the community speaking to each other. And we will be hopefully answering questions towards the end of the presentation today. I'll pass it along to Elizabeth to just give a quick little brief information about Mindscape Commons.
Thank you, Yumna. I have two very quick slides just to share with you a product we've developed at Coherent Digital. So as Yumna mentioned, Mindscape, it's a video database for faculty to use in their teaching and training. I know a lot of you on the call are faculty and likely prepping for the fall semester right now. Mindscape, the database, is comprised of hundreds of counseling skill training videos, 3 to 15 minutes long, so very easy to show or embed in as an assignment. Many were actually filmed in 360-degree videos, so you can actually view the content immersively with a head-mounted device, so you really sort of feel like you're in the room with the client. But we've also created various access levels, so you can view the content simply on a laptop or a mobile device, so no special equipment is needed. And many of our videos include interactivity, assessment questions to gauge comprehension, and we also include a lot of faculty support materials such as instructor guides, short book chapters, and discussion questions. The content that we've developed has really been in community with faculty and graduate students helping us to both create content and then advise us on content development. And there's been a real focus on inclusion, highlighting historically underrepresented voices. You can see some of the topics here that we've been developing. And we do have school and career counseling video content coming soon for those who might be teaching in that area this year. So that's just a quick overview of Mindscape. We'll include information on a free trial if you're interested in looking at it, and along with in our follow-up email to you, along with the recording of the webinar. And you can all always reach out to me or Yumna with any questions. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Yumna, for introductions.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I appreciate it. I now have the absolute pleasure of introducing our wonderful guest today. We have Dr. Maninder Kaur Ahluwalia, who is a professor and graduate program coordinator in the Department of Counseling at Montclair State University. She engages in research and scholarship with students and alumni focusing on the intersecting identities of racial and ethnic minorities in the US, with particular attention to the psychological impact of racism and discrimination on individuals, communities, and systems. She has served on the editorial boards for the Journal for Social Action in Counseling and Psychology, as well as the Asian American Journal of Psychology on Ethnic Minority Affairs of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Alawalia also has a consultation practice where she engages in assessment and training related to multicultural competence and socially just practices. I also have Dr. Rebecca L. Toporek, who is a professor and department chair in the Department of Counseling at San Francisco State University. Her scholarship focuses on multicultural training, whiteness and racism, privilege, social justice advocacy, and college and career counseling. Collaborating with students and alumni, her current research focuses on advocacy and activism in counseling and psychology, long-term unemployment and homelessness, and the role of advocacy in community college counseling. Dr. Toporek has written or co-written over 60 journal articles and book chapters, was co-editor and co-founder for the Journal for Social Action in Counseling and Psychology, co-developer of the ACA advocacy competencies, and has co-authored and or co-edited 5 books on multicultural training and social justice. Thank you both so much for being here today and offering your time and talents toward this webinar. I will pass it along to you both.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Yumna. Shall I go ahead and share the slides, Maninder?
That'd be great.
All right. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to see you here and excited to share with you in this short amount of time that we have. We'll be going really quickly through some ideas and some thoughts that we have and want to engage you with it. So welcome. Should we just jump right in?
I think so.
Okay. So we're going to be focused on taking action, creating social change through strength, solidarity, strategy, and sustainability. And I'm excited because I think that some of you who are attending today might already be a little bit familiar with this, having either know us, seen us, taken a look at the book. This is described in depth in a book that came out about a year ago, same title. You see the book cover on this first slide that goes into these steps. And what we'll be doing today is just kind of walking through each of the different concepts: strength, solidarity, strategy, and sustainability, and how those factor into social action. And really the goal of this book was to help people move toward taking action on issues that they care about. And there is no shortage of issues in the world for the general public to act on, as well as professionals, counseling, psychology, helping professionals, human development. And so we hope that you engage with this and take a look at how this might be relevant for you in your work. So we wanted to start by introducing who we are.
And I'm wondering, sorry.
Yes,
Rebecca,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'm wondering if you want to go ahead and do that poll first.
Oh, sure, yeah. So do you want to introduce the poll, Maninder?
Sure. So we just want to get a sense of the room, the Zoom room. So we're asking you just to comment on, how comfortable you are with taking social action. So very comfortable, but you'd like to be more confident, not so comfortable, or very uncomfortable. So if you could go ahead and submit those, it gives us a sense of where we're at. Thank you.
We're just gathering a couple more votes. I'll prompt the poll whenever we get most of our replies in. Thank you.
Thanks, folks. So I think we got a nice sense of the room. So most folks are comfortable, but would like to continue to gain some more confidence. Some people are super comfortable and some maybe not so comfortable. I think that's where many of us are, right? Sort of in that middle ground where we have engaged in some action, but could gain some more confidence around doing it, or learn some more strategies and tips to do it better.
Thank you. And I think this is perfect. I'm actually excited to see, and I appreciate people who contributed to the poll, because I think, I'll speak for myself anyway, I would also fall in the somewhat confident and would like to be better at it category. And so I join with you all in that practice. So what we'd like to do is to introduce who we are, talking a little bit about how who we are, all of us in the Zoom room today, shapes kind of how we take action, and the strengths that allow us to do that, as well as the challenges, and then talk a little bit about the purpose of the webinar. So I'll introduce myself first, or Maninder, you want to go first?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, so as Yumna said in that really beautiful introduction, I'm Rebecca Toporek. I'm department chair and professor at San Francisco State University. For our purposes, I think what's maybe more important contextually to know is that I identify as a white woman. I am Canadian by birth and still nationality, but also have taken on a US nationality as well. I have intermittent disabilities. I identify as heterosexual because I've been in a heterosexual relationship for 35 years. But internally, it's not so straightforward and binary in that way. I identify as a cisgender woman, although my gender identity is somewhat more inclusive than that. There are multiple other aspects of my identity that I think could be important in relation to social action. And the last one I'll just mention is the privilege that I have as somebody who's highly educated, who's in academia, who's in a stable economic situation, although I grew up in a somewhat unstable economic situation due to mental health issues in my family.
So similarly, I could say that I'm a professor at Montclair State and graduate program coordinator, but I think also what's really important is my identities and how they intersect and shape who I am. So I am a 50-year-old cisgender female. I identify as heterosexual. I'm in a long-term, I guess I should say I have a fiance. I'm in a long-term committed relationship. I am US born of Indian descent, so my parents are immigrants. And I am middle to upper middle class, largely because of my parents' foundation and what they gave to us, what they built and then gave to us. I could also say that I am Sikh. That's a very strong identity. That's my religious identity. And I'm not of Indigenous heritage, which is important, I think, to note, because it's when we're not of Indigenous heritage, we often don't think about the fact that we're not and that we're sitting on someone else's land. And I'm a US born US citizen, and so that along with it comes with a lot of privileges. So as Rebecca said, we both have a lot of privileged identities, and we have some identities that are oppressed. But together, that's what sort of has made us who we are and has made us interested in what we're interested in. You'll see on the right-hand side, there's a photo of myself and Rebecca from maybe a few years ago. And that, I think, describes a large part of how I've been able to become more engaged in the academic process of social justice is through her. So that's what I'd like to say about my identities.
Thank you. And thank you, Maninder, for really highlighting our relationship with Indigenous communities currently as well as historically. And I want to state that both Maninder and I are on unceded Chochenyo Ohlone land, which is now called the East Bay of San Francisco, California, and really want to honor the Chochenyo Ohlone people who are here and continue to steward the land and protect the sacred land here, and feel a lot of gratitude for the welcome and willingness to allow us to be on this land. And I also want to say that my ability as a white person to work towards social action, especially around racism and anti-racism, I cannot ever express my gratitude enough to Meninder for her camaraderie in this and her willingness to help me learn to be better all the time. So thank you, Meninder. So we'd like for you to take a minute, and as you participate in this webinar, we'd like to ask you to maybe keep a blank sheet next to you and just jot down reflections that you have. Certainly, if you have notes of things that you want to remember, that's fine. But what's maybe even more important is just thoughts and feelings that come up for you, insights that you have, reflections that you have. And one of those has to do with your own identities and your own context, historically as well as currently, and how that shapes the issues you care about, but also how that shapes what you can bring to social action, the strengths, who you're connected to, the strategies, and your ability to implement different strategies, as well as your ability to take care of yourself and others in that process. And in that reflection, you can think about the people that you're connected to, again, historically, but also currently, stories that you learned growing up, stories that help you kind of define who you are and the way you want to be, about what you believe is right, what you believe is gracious, what you believe is important. Some of that comes in sayings that we learned early on. Some of it may just simply look like values, but how that holds you and how that can help both sustain you and guide you, and communicate to others about what's important to you. So finally, with this slide, we just want to suggest again what the purpose of the webinar is, and I'm going to be very brief in that because I think we've touched on that multiple times so far today. We'd like for you to engage with this webinar in terms of thinking of a specific issue that may be important to you. It may be rematriation of Indigenous land. It may be fighting racism. It might be taking a look at economic injustice. Whatever it is for you, there are so many issues that we could try to address. I think for the purposes today, if you could try to choose one to really think about as we walk through the model.
And the model that we refer to is the S-Quad model.
All right. So again, we'd like for you to think about an issue and focus, what matters to you. And we have just a few images up here about possible issues that you might identify. So I want to give a moment of quiet and peace to reflect on some of these images, as well as for you to reflect on images that come to mind for you when you think about what matters to you, what might be a focus that you could take over the next 40 minutes or so. If you can put thoughts, reactions in the chat and share that with others. And again, as mentioned, as Yumna mentioned at the beginning, for chat, if you can just click the panelists and attendees, and that way other folks can also see what you're sharing. See some really powerful things coming up in the chat. As we go through the rest of the session today, you can think and you may find that what you want to focus on becomes more refined, or maybe you decide, you know what, this is too big for me right now. I actually want to choose something that feels a little bit more manageable. And I think that's one of the challenges with social action, is that it does feel so big. It does feel like there's so much. And so sometimes what can happen is a kind of paralysis for us, feeling overwhelmed, feeling like we don't know where to start, we don't know what to do, we don't really have the circumstances or the resources or the mental capacity to really address it. And what we hope that you'll consider is that you do actually, you may not have the capacity to address all of this, but you do have the capacity to identify something. And to at least start there is important, and that if everybody who cares actually does at least one thing, then that would be huge. So feel free to keep putting that into the chat, but at the same time, recognize that that can change and that can shift. So think about, what is the issue or concern that you'd like to focus on? And again, just jot that on the piece of paper that you have next to you. And then even within that issue or concern, is there a specific aspect of it that you could focus on? So for example, if I'm looking at houselessness or housing instability, that might be the issue, but what specific aspect can I focus on with that? Could it be, maybe I might choose people who are being removed from their homes forcibly because of job loss. Maybe that's something specific that I'd like to focus on. To think about, okay, who's affected by that negatively, and in what ways? What are the communities, the people? Are there areas near where I live or areas more remote? And then to think about, how am I connected to that issue? So for example, I have very stable housing based on my economic situation, but also my social safety net and my family safety net. So how am I connected to that? And what does it mean to be somebody who doesn't have that experience? And how is that important in the action that I take? Then also to look at who's already working on this issue and what are they already doing? And in what way are they bringing in expertise, and how might I be able to contribute to that? These are all questions that we'll be addressing as we talk through the model. The other aspect is, what do I want to try to change or have an impact on? And that could be aspirational, but then that also may become sub-goals that you have. Maninder, would you like to introduce the model?
I would, thanks. So we call it the S-Quad model because there are 4 S's. And so we are going to look at 4 aspects. So the first is strengths, assets, and resources that we have. The second is solidarity. The third is strategy. And the fourth is sustainability. And sometimes people are like, what's the difference between strength and strategy? So strengths are kind of the puzzle pieces, the individual skills or assets and resources that we have. And then strategy is how we put that together to move something forward.
So talking about the first S, strengths or assets or resources, again, we have some images here, and just want to take a minute, have you reflect on the images. And as you reflect on those images, I'm going to present you with a set of questions to think about, or examples. All right, so starting with some examples, some strengths, skills, and knowledge would be things like persuasiveness, organizational skills, communication, creativity, professional expertise that you have, technology, technological skill, or the resource of technology, social media skills, relationship building skills, and all of us have personal skills that we've developed over time because of who we are through experiences that we've had as individuals. We also most likely have professional skills that we can add to this. And so as you think about the skills that you bring into your daily life, into your work, but also just in the way that you navigate and maneuver through life, those skills are things that we want you to think about in terms of social action. Because often what we think about is we see an issue and we think we have to respond to it in a particular way, but we'd like you to take a step back and first say, okay, what do I have to offer? And that's actually going to guide the way that you look at strategies and how you engage in the social action, rather than feeling like you need to develop a whole new set of skills to say, okay, what do I have now? What do I already have? And then assets are things like access to money, space, equipment, access to people who have the resources or power, even though you might not, technology platforms, your position, your degree, your education, and then access to people who have skills or knowledge. So social capital is a really big aspect of resources, and not to take that lightly. So as you reflect on that and think about that, to think about, okay, what professional skills can you bring? What skills do you have as a person that you can bring in? What resources do you have access to? And do you have relationships with people who have power, skills, knowledge, or resources? And the social capital may be through your institution or your workplace. It may be through the people that you know in your community. It may be through your family. So for example, I don't have a ton of technology skills, but I actually have family members who have a ton of technology skills. So when I have something technical that I need around a social action thing, I've got people that I can call on who can help me with that. So those are some of the things that we'd like for you to think about. And if you just take a minute and jot down just a couple of thoughts, you're going to need to come back to that later. But for our purposes now, if something just comes to mind, jot that down for yourself. Maninder, want to take the next S?
Yes. So solidarity. So if you take a second, look at the slide, and think about what solidarity means to you. And if you take a second and just drop it in the chat, that'd be helpful, just to see what people think of, what people feel when they see the word solidarity and when they see these images. So some of those words and phrases that all of you are coming together, saying community, working together, struggling together, sharing power, are all part of solidarity. You also talked a little bit about the benefits of solidarity personally, right? It feels good, it sustains you and things like that. And so we'll talk about that aspect of it a little bit, this collective care piece, when we talk about sustainability, that fourth S. But right now we're thinking about that sharing power, working collectively towards one goal. So some examples of solidarity are honoring and lifting up that expertise of the community, standing with others in the face of injustice, demonstrating respect, support, and understanding of others in culturally relevant ways, engaging in mutual support, reaching out to provide support, and asking for support when needed. So this idea of literally, and again, if you go back to the images for a second in your head, is that image of standing side by side with others. You're not above someone else when you're trying to work. It's really, you're trying to work with somebody side by side. And when we're working on an issue where we're not part of the community, it's really important to honor and lift up the expertise of the community and follow their lead, as opposed to trying to lead a community into an area that we think is important. And that's what solidarity really is. So we're going to have you reflect on some of these questions, right? And so somebody wrote that it's important to have consent from the group that you're acting in solidarity with. Absolutely. So consent, and I would even argue really buy-in, right? This idea that they are leading us to the vision that they see. So it's important to reflect on how are you an insider or an outsider to the community that you are taking action for, with. What's your motivation for joining in solidarity? How do you know what the issues are? Like, who do you find out from? What have you read? Where do you get your news from? What are your issues and concerns, and how are those related to those of the community? So you might have some issues. For example, Rebecca was talking about houselessness or homelessness, and thinking about what are the issues that somebody who is homeless, and what is your issue with homelessness? Like, you may have a different perspective and a different experience of it because you're not in it. What are you willing to contribute to the community, and what is your investment? And I don't know that there's right answers for these things, but knowing what your limits are and what you can give emotionally, time-wise, financially, et cetera, is really important. Because if you don't think it through and you have these big, grand, save the world kinds of ideas that many of us came to the profession with, we'll be disappointed and we actually won't get anything done. So really thinking about concretely, what are you willing to contribute, and what is your actual investment? And is there anything that you need to give up in your own life to partner with the community? What would you have to, time is finite, finances, resources, et cetera, are finite. So what are you willing to give up in terms of your own life and to partner with the community? And I just want to go back to the first question. So as you reflect on these are much deeper questions that I'm sort of allowing the time for right now. But when I think of myself and I work with, let's say, the Sikh community, I'm an insider in the Sikh community as I'm Sikh, but I'm also not an immigrant. I'm US born. And so for an immigrant Sikh, they have a very different experience than I'll have. For somebody who's working class or somebody from solidly middle class, they might have a very different experience than I do. I was born in the city, in New York City, and I grew up in a suburb, moved back to the city. It's a very different experience, for example, than an immigrant who's coming to Queens, New York. And I know this because I've done research and worked with the community, and I've hit a lot of roadblocks because I don't always see how I'm an outsider to the very community that I'm a part of.
All right, thank you, Maninder. And so we'll move to the next S, strategy. And once you've laid a foundation of beginning to really think about your strengths, your resources, your assets, and then also thinking about solidarity in relation to the issue that you've identified, then you can start thinking about strategy. Now, before we go into too much about strategy, I want to emphasize, really aligned with what Maninder was talking about in terms of solidarity, is that if you really truly are in solidarity, one of the first things you'll know is what strategies are already being taken, and have an understanding of that, as opposed to sort of creating and thinking that you are the one building a strategy. Now, there may be times when you actually have some difficulty finding anybody taking action, or that the community that you are wanting to align with or wanting to support is not in a position to take action on this because of the power differential, because of other aspects that make it that your position allows you to do things differently than what they're allowed to. And the solidarity that you have can align you with what are their goals, how can they guide you in taking the action in the way that you have access and they may not have access, but finding a way to stay connected and keep the solidarity even with the strategy. So as you look at these images and see what comes to mind, And feel free to put in the chat what strikes you in terms of the different types of strategies that are represented here. And just feel free to share those as we take a minute to look at this, and then I'll share some specific examples with you. I see one thing in the chat, which is so exciting because yes, so many different ways of engaging. And that's really a big part of the point, is that there are many, many different ways. Creative and courageous. Oh, I love that. I'll share, disclose something Maninder and I noticed as we looked at a lot of the images we chose. We tended to choose a lot of women of color in images, and it's yeah, it was just an observation that we had. I think there are a lot of women in color who actually lead in social action. Where is wealth and power represented? That's a really interesting question. So I'm going to share a few strategies, and some of them, most of them, actually, you may already be familiar with. Some of them you may already use in your daily life and the social action that you take already. Some of them may seem pretty distant though. And so what I'd like to encourage you to think about is, what are some areas that you might want to develop more? And what are some areas where you might already use strategies, but maybe there are ways you can find to enhance your skill and the ability in using those strategies? And also, if these are strategies that you're already using, are they aligned with the solidarity with the community that you are hoping to support? So just a few examples, and again, in the book, we go into a lot more depth about each of these and provide even more examples. One is communicating and working with legislators and policymakers. Another is community organizing and coalition building. Another, communicating with and through media. Public displays of resistance. Creative displays of resistance. Change in your workplace or profession, and that could be all kinds of different strategies. And then individual interventions. So when you encounter a situation, whether it's microaggressions, assaults, those kinds of things, if you're looking to intervene as opposed to being a bystander, if you're going to step up, and what that might look like in terms of strategy. In the images that we saw in the previous slide, we saw many different examples. Creative displays of resistance could be things like music, it could be performance, it could be even signs, creative signs that come up. And then the community organizing and coalition building. Communicating and working through media can be through social media, it could be through doing podcasts, could be participating. And one of the things I'll share as a white person, a white woman with a fair amount of privilege, both economic and educational, is that I feel like my role and the strategies that I often take are actually to do what I can to see how I might support and provide avenues for people who have a voice that may not be heard as much, or may not have access to the kinds of venues that I have access to, and to hold those up. But also that there are lots of people with more expertise than I have on a lot of the issues that I care about. And so one thing I just want to mention that Maninder and I did about a year or so ago, and Elizabeth, who helped with this webinar, was critical in that, produced that, is a video that I'm really excited about, because we interviewed 13 different counselors and psychologists who take social action, who are really powerful in the work that they do. And we interviewed them about their social action, about what it means to be a counselor, a psychologist, or helping professional taking social action. What are some of the strengths they identify, how they build solidarity, the strategies, and then also sustainability. And the title of that is Helping Counselors and Psychologists as Advocates and Activists. And it's available through Alexander Street Press if anyone's interested. So take a minute and reflect on the strategies that you've used and think about, given what you know about the issues that you've chosen, the focus that you like to have, the strengths that you can identify for yourself, the community and your connection with the community, what strategies might you consider? Is this a strategy that you would engage in alone, or do you need to partner with others? Does this strategy require additional resources or skills beyond those that you already have? What are the costs and benefits of this strategy, and what are the possible outcomes? And these last two questions, I think, are really, really important because as you look at strategies, there are lots of different ways to address a problem. And looking at what the costs and benefits are for the community that you're hoping to support, as well as to yourself, is an important aspect of assessing the appropriate strategy. The possible outcomes of the strategy also is important, that some strategies may more effectively get the job done than other strategies. If I talk to my neighbor about an issue that I care about, well, that helps in terms of maybe my neighbor, but if my neighbor doesn't have any involvement or isn't able to make systemic change, then that strategy is a somewhat limited strategy. Now I'll shift to sustainability. Maninder?
Before we get to sustainability, can we just go back for a second to the previous slide?
Yes.
So the previous slide.
Wait, sorry. There we go.
So that previous slide, I think it's really important to think about the costs and benefits and the possible outcomes of a strategy. Even very simple everyday things that we do. I remember one of the most searing moments for me is when I was in a car. So when you're in a car and a black and brown man are driving, black or brown man are driving, and you're sitting next to them. I remember from my own perspective, thinking about when you get pulled over, what do you do? And I'm like, you argue, you argue, get angry, whatever. And that is not the strategy that most black and brown men were raised with, because that is not a safe strategy. So thinking about things from outside of your own perspective are really important. I think of myself as somewhat educated and somewhat learned, but I don't know what it's like to live in the body of someone else. And so it's a really humbling, that was a really humbling lesson. And I've had it more than once. To watch how other people have to react because of their own identities, and the costs of a strategy that works for me won't work for them.
Thanks, Maninder. Do we have a minute, and I can share a brief example also, because I really, really appreciate you bringing this up. And I think going back to identities at the beginning, when we had people talk about that, and Maninder, you provided such a beautiful example. The example that I have is actually from a coalition that I was a part of, and we came together to address issues of racism on our campus. And there were a group of started off 15, and the eventual group was about 9 people. And we all decided on a strategy as a group. And we sort of compromised to come up with a strategy that we could all agree with, and went forward with that strategy. And there were pretty significant consequences. But I'm really aware that the consequences for my colleagues of color were more severe than they were for me. And they also were more severe for those of my colleagues who had less of an economic buffer than I had. And so, although it was a strategy that we all agreed upon, it was really important for me to know that how it differentially affected people. And then the other piece of it was that surviving through the consequences that we had, it was really important to have that solidarity, that the 9 of us together, it was a very different experience than if it would have been just one of us taking that action. So. Shall we go to sustainability now, which I guess I just made a little entree into?
Yes, and I think sustainability is the thing that keeps us going, right? So if you stop and reflect and think about what keeps you going. If you think about, before the pandemic, during the pandemic, as we are semi-emerging from the pandemic, what in your life nourishes you? What helps you keep going? What helps you keep fighting the good fight? So if you want to take a minute, reflect on that, and then write it in the chat, that'd be great. And just to change the chat to everyone, so it's not just to the panelists, that would be great. Because right now I think we're the only ones who can see it. So when you go to chats, just change it to everyone. And then if you can just drop some notes, because I think people can benefit from hearing each other's sustainability. Thank you. Family, community, love, meditation, reflective practices, ancestors, right? These are the things that sustain us, our families. And so some of the pictures that you can see show you some of this. And oftentimes sustainability requires other people, but there's also times when sustainability can be a very solitary act, and that's important too, to have time alone. So you can see a little bit of both, right? The groups, the pairs, and the individual reflective practices that we engage in. Thank you so much for sharing some of those. So for myself, when Rebecca and I first met, one of the biggest things that I loved to do back then and still love to do is dance. And so dancing has been and has always been and continues to be a really important sustainability practice for me. It's been tough during the pandemic because I do a lot of partner dancing, but I look forward to being able to re-engage with that again. Thank you for doing the slides, Rebecca.
You're welcome. Are you ready to go to the next one?
Please.
Sorry, I jumped ahead.
So when you think about sustainability, you're really thinking about how to promote your wellness, right? And so a lot of our wellness includes aspects of, and this is maybe a little simplistic, but it's a way for us to remember the different components. Because oftentimes when we're engaging in social action, we don't stop and do a check. Like, oh, how's our head? How's our heart? How's our body? How's our spirit? How am I taking care of each of these aspects? So your head is your mind and your mental well-being. So things that can help sometimes are some quiet time, some time without our devices in our hand, and without following social media. Heart is your emotional health and your relationships. A lot of people talked about meaningful connection with family and community. Your body includes your physical well-being. So remembering to engage in some kind of physical activity, physical exercise, engaging in good nutrition. Those things are all really important and sometimes are one of the first things to slide when we're running around trying to juggle multiple things. And the last part is that spirit, that thing that anchors you to your beliefs and values. For many people, it's meditation or prayer or God or literally spirituality, broadly said. And so it's really, somebody said it seems similar to a medicine wheel. So this idea of like really remembering all these aspects of yourself when you're trying to engage in wellness. And so if you take a second to reflect on your own sustainability, and you can jot these on a piece of paper, but thinking about what practices do you engage on a daily basis. So not only what do we think is sustainability and what we like about sustainability and what we want to do, but what do we actually do? And this is a really good check-in, because while I know that when I engage in some kind of physical exercise and take a walk, I feel better and I have more energy and access to internal resources. I also know there's a lot of times I let that slip. That's one of the first things that slips. So thinking about what practices do you actually engage in on a daily basis? And then what practices sustain you through challenging times? And do those two things match? Are you doing what you need to do to sustain yourself? What aspects of your wellness do you tend to attend to least, right? So what do you not pay attention to? When do you notice it's hardest for you to practice sustainability? Oftentimes, that's when you most need to engage in sustainability. Do you have a sustainability buddy? And for much of my relationship with Rebecca, she has been my sustainability buddy. She reminds me of the things that nourish me. She reminds me of the things that are important to me, even if they're not important to her, right? So she knows what's good for me and reminds me to engage in the things that are good for me. And then that last piece is, how do you ensure that you continue to engage in sustainability? So if we think it's important, we know it helps, we know it works, how do you make sure that you will continue to do it, right? And for every person, that's a different thing. So for some people, it's an alarm on your phone. For other people, it's like Post-its on your mirror first thing in the morning, writing it into your calendar. And so finding ways to make sure you do it will help you ultimately take action. And oftentimes we think, oh, well, the action is more important than myself. Well, maybe. And I was raised that way. The problem with that is when we burn ourselves out, who's taking the action then? And so we have to take care of ourselves to continue to take the actions that we think are important. It's not that we're that important in the big scope of life, so I'm not trying to overstate our importance. But I'm saying is, if we think the work is important, then we need to take care of ourselves so that we could also take care of the work.
Can I just add one more thing, because I think that's such an important point, which is the other thing that I think can happen, at least I'll share it happens for me, is that when I am not practicing in sustainability, then my ability to act in solidarity goes down, that I'm more likely to maybe be very goal-oriented and less people-oriented, or become more brusque, or become more frustrated, or be absent without sharing that I'm absent, or just be more chaotic myself. And so I'm less able to be present with the people who are most important in this social action. And then I also don't think clearly. So even the strategies that I'm taking, I may not be doing very well, or may not be thinking ahead of time about what the consequences are of my actions. So the sustainability really does have to overlay or underlay everything that we're doing.
And so the last thing we're going to give you, in a sense, is, remember we said, how are you going to ensure you engage in sustainability? So one of the simple things that we often say is, get an envelope, ordinary envelope, fancy envelope, whatever you really like, and then some sticks, or some even strips of paper if you don't have these tongue depressor sticks, popsicle sticks. So even strips of paper. And I would do like 8, 10 strips, and put in things that will help sustain you, that will help sustain you, and put them in the envelope. And then that becomes kind of your repository for when you're feeling tapped out, for when you feel like you need something to sustain you. And you really want sustainability exercises or items that range in, high investment, low investment, high time, low time, right? So it might be like, for me, to go to Gurdwara, a place of worship, is a really important sustainability. But it might be I also need to do open house for my graduate school on that same Sunday. So while I may not be able to go to Gurdwara, what I might be able to do is to say a morning prayer, or listen to the morning prayer on my radio on the way to work, right? So thinking about small, little engagements and more larger engagements, like getaways or vacations, or taking a Sunday to yourself or something like that. Rebecca, do you want to add something about the sustainability activity? You say it better usually.
Sure. No, you said it beautifully, but I'm always happy to add more. So some of the other things are also having a range of things that might require other people or not require other people. because sometimes other people are just not available to us. And if we feel like we need that, then be creative about that. And part of the purpose of doing this as a randomized sort of pick out a random activity is that sometimes when we are feeling really stretched or really tired or burned out or whatever, it's hard for us to think about doing sustainability. And we may think like, oh, I could exercise, but that just seems, I just don't have the energy for that. And so sometimes we just don't do anything. And so for me, the thing I like about picking a randomized activity is by picking a stick, I'm committing to doing what's on there. And so it's like, I don't have to think about what I'm going to do. I just pick a stick and then I do that. As long as it's feasible in that given day. And if it's not feasible, then I pick another stick and I do that. And so it takes out the thinking part of sustainability, which sometimes I just don't have the capacity for. I just wanted to add that. So I know we're like wrapping up, but before we go to that, actually, let me jump back. We probably should have had a Q&A slide. So what we'd like to do is take a few minutes. We wanted to be sure to leave a few minutes. It looks like we've got about 5 minutes left that we can answer questions or address things that folks wanted us to address a little bit more. Again, I just wanted to mention that if you do want to dive into this more deeply, we would love to share the book with you, and that's published by Cognella. The title of the book is the same as the webinar, so it's easy to find. The book was actually written for the general public. We're in the process of writing a version that's specifically focused on helping professionals, counselors, psychologists, and other helping professional folks. So that'll be, I don't know, hopefully coming out in a year. So we have two other amazing co-authors who've joined us, Dr. Derek Bynes and Dr. Brian Rojas Arus. And so it's going to be, I think, a fabulous blossoming. But the book that is out right now goes into these areas in depth, and we'd love it. We'd also love to hear feedback from you about the book if you use it, not in chat, obviously, but at some other point, if you are already using it, we'd love to hear what you think. So feel free to put questions in the chat, anything that you'd like us to address in the last few minutes we have. Thank you, Sapna, for your feedback. I'm glad the students are finding it helpful. While we wait and see if anybody puts something in the chat, I hope this is okay, Maninder. I'd like to say that the things, this framework, or the components of the framework, it's not like we invented any of that. There are a lot of other people who've done a lot of work and offered up a lot of different models, frameworks, ideas, contributions. And so while I don't have the list of all the people that I would like to appreciate for all the work that they've done around taking action and providing resources, I do want to acknowledge that there have been a lot of people who've done a lot of really important work. Well, I don't see any questions or chat, and I'm looking forward to hearing the work that other people are doing. Oh, I do see one. Do we have time to address this? Yeah. Oh, good.
So the question is, how do we navigate situations when institutions we work for may be perpetuating injustices that we are trying to fight against? Triana, I think that's a great question, a complicated question, but I think in some ways, to me, and I'll let Rebecca address this as well, but if you remember thinking about costs and benefits, thinking about how do you stand together with other people, how do you make sure that you can eat the cost of whatever you choose to do, right? So what I chose to do as a woman of color at my institution, as a tenured professor, I knew I had tenure. It allows a certain kind of freedom to speak your mind with some consequence, but not grave consequence to my job, right? So thinking about, what are the costs and benefits, thinking about what can you do, thinking about how do you join with other people, and then thinking about how do you take care of yourself because you're working in a space that injustice are constantly perpetuated. The good news is there are lots of strategies and you have lots of skills to engage in it. The bad news is I think it's pretty much every institution is systemically unjust. Rebecca?
Yeah, absolutely echoing all of that. And the only other thing that I might add is that sometimes it's also helpful to make sure to have connections outside of your institution. So partnering with people that are at your institution, making change, but then also being connected and finding connections to other professionals who might be doing similar work, who can be sustainability buddies that you can vent to, they can be sounding boards, or they have knowledge and strategies that you don't. And also even looking to professional associations to help support the change that you're trying to make. So really looking at solidarity, strengths, and numbers across the board. The example that I gave earlier was exactly that. It was, we were addressing an issue that was systemic within the college I was working in. And it's tough. And as Maninder said, and probably everybody on this call knows, all of our institutions have racism built in, sexism built in, have so much oppression built in, even by virtue of the history of higher education. Is built in an oppressive, systemic white supremacist way. And so it is a constant, and for, depending on our positionality, much more of an impact on some of us than others. So it looks like we are actually out of time, and this is a conversation that could go on. And I hope that when we eventually are in spaces together again, we can have more conversation about this. And until then, virtually, hopefully our paths will cross. Thank you, Elizabeth and Yumna, so much for the work that you did to pull this together and also to facilitate. And thank you again, Maninder, as always, my dear heart.
Thank you, Rebecca, Yumna, Elizabeth. It's been fantastic. And thank you
you
for everybody attending.
Yes, thank you, everybody attending. Love to see all your names and chats coming up.
We have so many thank yous. Thank you so much, Dr. Alawalia and Dr. Toporek, for such an amazing presentation. It's always such a pleasure to work with both of you. We're just very grateful for your time today, sharing your model, and just keeping it so interactive with participation and engagement. And thank you to the attendees for being here and sharing. Yumna?
Thank you all so much. I'm so inspired after this conversation personally myself. Thank you, Dr. Toporek and Dr. Alawalia, again, for joining us today and just giving us such a personal and vulnerable and raw, explanation of how you all take on taking action. So thank you for that. And the recording will be sent out. So for everyone eager to kind of rewatch and relearn, the recording will be sent out in just a couple of days. So thank you again for staying engaged with us. And we hope to see everyone soon for our next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.